there any relevance of native speaker norms? That's a question for TEFLologists. Is it better to focus on form or to focus on forms? That's a question for TEFLologists. If you use a textbook, is your classroom authentic, or should your approach be more learner-centric? From feedback to learner autonomy, we'll discuss it all on TEFLology.
Hi, I'm Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to the TEFLology Podcast, a podcast all about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL Pioneers.
Okay, so for this week's TEFL Pioneer, we'd like to dedicate this section to the life and work of Stephen Bax, who I don't know if you know, but he sadly passed away recently.
Okay.
I think last month, actually, or December.
Right.
At the time we record this. So 2017, yeah. So as I said, today I'm going to talk about Stephen Bax's life and work. Okay. So first of all, Stephen was born in South Africa in July 1960, before moving to Zimbabwe, which was then...
Is it Rhodesia?
Correct. And he lived there until the age of 11. And he then returned to Nottingham with his family, near your neck of the woods, Rob.
Yeah, near, but a bitter rival of Derby's.
Oh, right, yes, yeah. So after he graduated from university, he started his career in teaching in 1981, and he went to teach in Sudan. And he then studied Arabic in Syria before working in Algeria as part of his teacher training. And this led to a postgraduate certificate in education for the teaching of English as a foreign/second language from the University College of Northern Wales, Bangor.
Okay.
Which is now...
Was it part of the University of Wales?
It's now Bangor University.
Oh, okay.
So, yeah. I should say that this first part is from an obituary taken from the Times education website. So that gives you a bit of an idea of his importance, maybe. So in 1985, after he completed his MA, or his postgraduate certificate, he was employed by the British Council in Iraq for 3 years, for gaining experiences teaching in other parts of the world. I think in Latin America, something that he mentioned.
When was he in Iraq, sorry?
From 1985.
Well, did that coincide with any stuff going on in that part of the world?
Maybe late 80s? No, early 90s, I guess.
Right, okay.
That's the first,
Right.
Okay, yeah, so anyway, he went to Iraq and worked for the British Council there for 3 years, I believe. And when he returned, he then pursued an MLit, a Master of Letters.
Yeah.
And also, according to this, an MSc, a Master of Science.
Okay.
So he got both.
What's the difference between an MLit and an MSc? Is one like a research degree and one a taught
I'm not sure.
degree?
It says in this obituary that he got both.
Okay.
One is related to science, one's related to letters, but they were both within applied linguistics.
Okay.
It may have just been one thing, I'm not sure. And he then went on to achieve his PhD from the University of Kent. He held academic positions at Canterbury Christchurch University.
Hooray!
And why that reaction, Rob? Do you want to explain?
That's where I did my PhD.
Which we should say you've just passed and got. And
haven't got the certificate yet, but yeah.
Congratulations.
Cheers.
Yeah.
I'll talk about that in the next episode.
Okay. So he was there until 2009, and then he moved on to the University of Bedfordshire until 2012. And he worked for I think it's called the Clt Institute.
Okay.
Don't ask me what that stands for, but the Clt Institute there, before finally going on to work at the Open University as Professor of Modern Languages and Linguistics until his passing. I'm now going to talk about his work, and I've chosen 3 things that, I guess more on a personal level for me. Not the third one, but we'll see. So the first time I came, and I was talking about this with Rob before, the first time I came across Stephen Bax's work is with a point and counterpoint article that he wrote in 2003 called The End of CLT, A Context Approach to Language Teaching. And I read this in, I think, 2010, just when I was getting more into sort of reading stuff. And I think I'd moved out of the language school job that I was in, and I was trying to get more into my MA and stuff. So
I think that was when we were working together at this university we're currently sitting at.
Yeah.
And so you were doing your dip pet. Was that what it was?
Some sort of postgraduate course.
Yeah.
I'm not sure why I did, but yeah.
Yeah, and I think I was either doing my MA or just starting my, and I remember you coming and showing me this article, and you were like really excited about it.
Yeah, well, I liked the because I think up until that point I was just doing CLT, and that's the only thing I knew at the time. Like that's the only thing I got from my CELTA course, and that's what I was kind of armed with coming to Japan.
Yeah,
and he basically tries to call for an end to all of this. I think this is the point article because it's a point and counterpoint. I don't think this is in response to anything. I think this is the argument he's making. But the paper calls for CLT as the central paradigm to be replaced with a context approach, which places context at the heart of the profession. Yeah, in his words.
So I think that's an interesting idea. So I cited this in my thesis, but I can see some issues with it.
I think there might be. Yeah, so what he argues is that CRT neglects the context in which it's conducted, pointing to the way people, often young people, I think he's kind of alluding to, in a faraway land, like I just said, come armed with CRT, or aspirations of CRT, and not a lot else. So they seem to try and be assimilating everyone to CLT, and not really thinking about the context that they're in. So he refers to this as a CLT attitude, and exemplifies this through quotes from teachers and authors. He used real quotes from authors and teachers to kind of bring out this attitude. It's not kind of fully developed, I think. I mean, it's quite a short article, but I think that's an interesting way of finding an attitude, if there is one.
Yeah. Could you briefly explain what the context approach is, or what he means by context?
Yeah. So he argues for a context approach instead, which considers the whole context, considers methodology as one factor amongst others, and calls for the validation or revalidation of others. And what he means by context is, I think in this part of the article he borrows from Adrian Holiday's appropriate methodologies, where he says that teachers should first look at the local context, the educational context, the classroom context, and the individual learning context before anything else. So before you just go in and do your CLT class, you should look around a bit and be a bit more aware of your surroundings and you should then decide whether CLT is worthy or not. I think, that's the general gist of the idea. But this kind of, at the time, this kind of struck a chord with me. I thought this is a good way of, this was kind of the first paper I read that was critical of CLT. So that's why it kind of left its mark. Okay, so that was his first contribution for me. Perhaps his biggest contribution to the industry was his work in CALL, computer-assisted language learning, which, weirdly, we haven't really talked about much on this podcast.
We've covered it a few times, but it's not a major theme.
We talked about it in episode 5. I checked today. I tried
Dogme versus Call.
Yeah, so I tried to compare Call to Dogme unsuccessfully. I don't know what I was trying to do, but that was episode 5. Go back and listen. But he had two seminal papers. One was called Call Past, Present, and Future, and the other one was called Making Call Work Towards Normalization. And they were both published in System. And as I said, this is the area where he's perhaps most well known. So what I'm going to talk about now is I attended his plenary talk in 2012 in Kobe, and he talked about the topic of normalization. Now, what do you think normalization means in terms of technology?
Well, making it a normal part of everyday practice, something like that.
That's what I would assume too. But has he taken the local context into account?
He kind of does in a way. Like he talks about normalization being the state at which things are taken for granted and don't really, to the point where we don't really notice technologies in our daily practice or habits. So he talked about things like putting on his glasses in the morning as a normalized activity, or picking up a pen and writing on a whiteboard as being a thing we don't question anymore. It's technology, but we don't see it as technology anymore.
What is technology though?
Exactly, yeah.
We don't question. We don't bang flints together to make fire anymore. Is that technology?
No, but that was probably normalised at one point in history. But
It was denormalised.
in his plenary, he asked us to continuously question if certain technologies will ever normalise or fade away, and think about the socio-technical dynamics involved. And he plotted the trajectory of normalisation, first beginning with a trigger. So seeing something that looks interesting. A lot of people go to conferences and they talk about this new technology. That's often a trigger. Followed by fear and doubt. That is then followed by a fever. And then after that, he kind of says normalisation usually takes hold kind of after the fever has died away. And he compared that to a love affair. That there's fever, and then it normalises. There's fear and awe. There's the trigger.
Are there any examples of technologies that have been normalized within language teaching?
Well, I mean, there's like I just said, whiteboards.
Okay, more recent ones.
More recently.
I mean, like in terms of the language classroom. If I went to a language classroom and the teacher said, "Okay, now everybody take out your phones and Google something,"
Yeah.
I'd find that kind of surprising.
I do that.
Right.
In classes sometimes.
Interactive whiteboards felt like there was a strong push for them 10
Yeah.
years ago.
But they never
really quite worked.
So he talks about the factors why things don't normalise, and that's why he said socio-technical factors, things like cost, things like how difficult it is, that kind of policies, that kind of thing.
One example I can think of actually in terms of smartphones, I remember in about 2011, 2012, there was an article in the Clt Call journal about what students prefer reading from, and it was it was a study on students reading homework, and they compared paper to computer screens to phone screens, and it was in that order of popularity. So phone screens were the least popular. And I read something more recently, I think published last year, which said that students now prefer to read on their phones. So that just in 5 years, that's completely reversed.
Yeah.
So maybe not for the teachers, but for students, that technology is normalised, and using phones as part of their language learning has normalised a little bit.
Yeah, or it's normalising.
Right.
Maybe. But so he also challenged people to get beyond or not get blinded by the wow factor of technology, and he basically said that a lot of presentations at call conferences don't do this. Basically, they just say, "Here's my technology, isn't it great? Look at all the colours," but they don't actually get to the point of how is this going to affect learning or change learning, or so they don't get beyond the technology side of it. Basically,
remember the Angry Birds presentation we attended once?
Oh, vaguely.
You can teach multiples of 10,000, and they just ended up with everyone playing Angry Birds.
Vaguely, yeah, something like yeah. But so he kind of filled me with skepticism, a healthy skepticism towards call, and a lot of his studies are in the normalisation and questioning, that kind of area. His third contribution, which we won't go into too deeply, was the Voynich manuscripts. Do you remember from episode 2?
Yes.
Which was the 2nd of July 2014.
Wow.
It's coming up for 3.5, almost 4 years.
4 years, yeah.
We first talked about the Voynich manuscripts. I won't go into this because I think Rob did quite a good review of what all that was about. But
I don't know if there's been any developments.
I'm not sure. There probably has, but just to briefly talk about, the Voynich manuscripts are something that was owned by the guy called Voynich, right? He was a shopkeeper, I remember you talking about at the time, 4 years ago. And this was a manuscript that hadn't been deciphered up until when Stephen Bax did this, basically. And it's from the 15th century. And go back and listen to that for more information. But they were his 3 major contributions, I think. And over the years, he's worked on many other projects, including developing content for the BBC, the British Council, and he also did some work in eye tracking technology, which I talked about with Anna Cianova. Again, go back and listen to that. So, and even up until his almost close to his time of passing, he was winning awards, and I think you talked about this in a few episodes back. He won an Elton award for digital innovation. Can you remember that award? What he won it for?
It's on the tip of my brain.
He won it for a software called Text Inspector, which examines text difficulty and lexical composition. Yeah, so it's very sad that Steve Bax passed away. The fact that he was winning awards right up until his death shows that I think he was only just getting started. I think so. On a personal note, I think his writing and presenting style is very accessible and engaging. That's why I first kind of got into his work. And his book, Discourse and Genre, was made a quite bland topic that I don't really like, quite a more palatable. And I'll continue to use that book. I think, yeah.
It's got a good cover as well.
Yeah.
I don't know if he designed the cover.
Yeah. So it's a shame that we didn't get a chance to interview him, I think. But somebody who did was Darren Elliot, who's also based in Japan, and he records video interviews with educators around the world. So that's available on YouTube, and we'll post a link to it with this podcast.
Yeah, it's called The Lives of Teachers.
Lives of Teachers, yeah. So that was today's TEFL pioneer, Professor Stephen Bax.
TEFL News.
Today's TEFL news is, it's not actually TEFL news, it's TEFL news.
Okay.
How are you,
What do you think that means?
What does that stand for?
Well, that's my question to you. What do you think?
How do you spell it?
What's the letters?
TLFL.
TLFL.
The T, the F, and the L are the same.
Teaching Latin as a foreign language.
Correct, yes. Yeah.
Nice.
So this is a story that appeared in The Guardian on the 22nd of January by Francis Perraudin. I'm not sure how to pronounce that name. But this is about a school in the UK which has stopped teaching Latin after 600 years.
Wow.
It was quite a long time.
It's a long course.
Yes. The students are knackered. So this is a school in North Yorkshire in Sheffield, and it's going to stop teaching Latin for the first time because of funding restrictions, and this is going to start from September this year. The school is called Richmond School. It's a comprehensive school, formerly known as Richmond Grammar School, and it was officially ratified by Elizabeth I in 1568. So this summer, 12 students will sit the GCSE Latin exams. Maybe it was last summer 12 students sat the exams, and maybe 17 this summer. But after that there'll be no more Latin classes. In the UK, each year about 10,000 pupils take a GCSE in Latin, and about 1,500 do an A-level, which is an A-level, how would you describe that? It's something you do when you're 17.
Last 2 years of your secondary school?
Yeah, in the UK you do secondary school up until you are 16, and then you do your A-levels between 16 and 18, and then you go to university for 3 years.
Basically you need a certain amount of A-levels to get into university. Right?
Exactly.
So you need like 3 A's to get into a top university.
Yeah, there's kind of a difference to the American system or the system in some other countries. But that number of students taking qualifications in Latin is decreasing year on year.
I wonder where it ranks in the popularity of foreign languages at GCSE and A-level level.
Something's got to go, hasn't it? I guess, and Latin, it's not a dead language. Well, it is a dead language.
It is a dead language.
Would probably be on the chopping board first.
Well, so this is my question. What are the pros and cons of teaching Latin? Because I've heard, people kind of dismiss it as a dead language. But there must be.
Dismissing it.
I've heard people just now dismissing it as a dead language. But there must be reasons that people want to study it. So I went hunting. I did a little hunt on the internet, and I've collated a few different reasons. So these come from a number of different sources. But if readers are interested, there's a good article called "Why You Should Learn a Dead Language." Again, in The Guardian from 2013 by Josephine Livingston. First. It makes learning a second, third, or fourth language easier because Latin is linked to a number of European languages.
So it makes learning a second, or third, or fourth European language easier.
Yes.
Not in general.
No, but why would you learn another language?
Right. But I've also heard that learning one foreign language will make the next one easier.
Right.
Regardless of what it is.
Yeah.
Obviously, if it's learning Latin while learning French or Spanish, there's going to be obvious connections you can make.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you learn Latin, then that would open up all of the European languages to you in a sense. But if you learn French, would that also open up the same languages to you? Like if there's the same common root?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that learning Latin or studying Latin helped me with a lot, but so did studying French, to be honest, was raising my awareness of English grammar.
Right.
Because you don't learn English grammar in schools in England.
Mm.
But by studying foreign languages, then you're kind of forced to think about the grammar of English.
Right. Yeah. The second reason in favour of teaching or learning a dead language, it connects us to the literature of the past.
Okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
So, yeah, you have to study people in their own words to understand them. So if you read this literature in its original language, then you can understand history and you can gain a greater appreciation for these classical texts. And obviously that doesn't just apply to Latin, it can apply to any dead language.
Sure.
What do you think?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I that's what I was going to say. I'm sure it opens up lessons of history and culture, or through Latin you can learn about real histories and real culture.
Right.
And also, I guess, the limitations of how they described things in their world.
Yeah.
It's like when you speak Welsh. Like Welsh is an old language, so they don't have new words for new things. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see where the limitations of language of Latin were at the time.
Right.
Yeah.
So you mean it as a way just to understand the nature of language better?
Yeah, because that would be how Latin or people using Latin would have interacted with each other.
Romans.
Yeah.
And stuff.
Yeah.
The next reason, maybe we'll get a bit sociological, it bridges the class divide. So one of the reasons given by the teachers at Richmond School or one of the reasons that they were upset about Latin being removed was they said that cutting access to Latin affects social mobility. So they said it's very hard to get access to Latin and the classics anywhere outside of London and the southeast of England. That has a knock-on effect on access to university degrees, especially at the leading universities. So, according to them, getting into some of the top universities in the UK requires some familiarity with Latin. I'm not sure exactly in what ways, but I guess it could show up in like entrance exams in some way, or just in terms of being conversant in certain things. I'm not sure.
So that's interesting. So they're saying by removing Latin, they're limiting students' social mobility.
Yeah. Well, so this is a school in Yorkshire, and they're basically saying there's a historical north-south divide in the UK in terms of people learning Latin. So people in the south learned it and people in the north didn't. And they're saying that this is partly connected to things like university entrance and upward social mobility. So Latin was reserved for the upper classes and the people in the south, and the people in the north, it was kind of kept away from them. And this is a case of a school in the north that's losing its provision of Latin. So they're saying it has issues that might influence social mobility.
I don't think this is indicative of Yorkshire. I think they're removing it from all of the UK Latin.
Right.
I'd imagine.
Yeah, but they're saying that historically there's always been this divide, and now there's this school in the north.
But I wonder
that was teaching
if shifting demographics mean that probably always Latin has been taught at school for, basically wealthier schools. Or,
Right.
For kids who come from wealthier families.
Yeah.
And if anything, getting rid of Latin keeping Latin might increase that divide or keep that divide open.
Well, only if you. I see what you mean, but if you're getting rid of it in one place but keeping it in other places, then that
right. If that's what's happening.
Right.
I imagine Latin, the teaching of Latin has been decreasing in schools across the UK for the last.
Yes, well
years.
that's what I said at the start.
Right. So it's not only just the schools from lower income areas that are getting rid of Latin and keeping it for higher income areas.
Yeah, but I think it's probably the case that it's disappearing from those schools because again, lack of funding, lack of practical use. Like you can afford if you're living if you come from a rich family and you go into a private school, you can afford like an indulgence in terms of learning Latin, I guess. Whereas if you're living somewhere else where you don't have that luxury, then you maybe it's not such a priority. But that does perhaps have knock-on effects for your social circles and being able to communicate with people from the sort of the upper classes and stuff. Yeah.
All the kids in London have Latin these days.
Yeah. Well, apparently it is mostly in London that Latin is taught. London and the southeast. So there you go.
In all parts of London?
Yes.
Or in certain parts of London?
I imagine in certain parts of London.
Right.
Do you
but,
think the way forward is to make Latin into like a hipster thing? Like just hipstery, make it a bit hipstery. That's what cut this bit out.
So the other two reasons, it improves your intelligence. It's an intellectual workout. That's one reason.
What's the research behind that?
Well, we'll get to that in the reasons against learning dead languages.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder. It probably is, but I wonder if it is any more than learning any other language.
Right.
And something more practical.
Yeah. And finally, again, an academic point, it helps with the study of law and medicine because of the vocabulary crossover. So I listen to a legal podcast, and there's a lot of Latin on that, and they always have to stop and explain to everyone what they're talking about. Yeah.
Right.
So those are the reasons in favour of teaching dead languages. The reasons against teaching dead languages, including Latin. One, it's of little practical communicative use because no one else speaks it. Two, it won't really help in finding jobs, although it may help indirectly, I guess, if we accept the class divide argument before. Three, it's elitist. And four, it doesn't improve your intelligence, and there's little evidence in research for transfer from learning a language to other domains of intelligence. So it's kind of asserted that it's an intellectual workout and it's good for you. But like people say, learning grammar is going to help your reasoning, your abstract reasoning, which might help you with mathematics and so on. But there isn't actually a lot of evidence, apparently, that is the case.
Two of those points seem to contradict each other. It's elitist, but by removing it, you're removing people's social mobility. So by keeping it there, it's still elitist. How they kind of seem to contradict.
I don't understand how they contradict.
Latin is elitist, but by removing it, that's detrimental to people's social mobility.
Well, it's elitist in the sense that people from the upper classes learn it, or are more likely to learn it.
Right.
And it reduces your social mobility if you don't learn it because you don't have access to the same knowledge, the same kind of social capital as those people do.
Right.
See what I mean?
Kind of.
Yeah. So those are the reasons in favour and against learning a dead language. So the question, I guess, is what do you think? Should Latin or other dead languages such as Greek or Sanskrit, not modern Greek, ancient Greek, or Sanskrit, be taught in schools? What do you think?
If I was going to put like a financial hat on, I'd say why can't they just combine all of these into an ancient languages program where they kind of look at everything, and it's not just about studying the language, they just observe all ancient languages. Because we already have history at school where we learn about the ancient Greeks, the Egyptians, the Romans. Why can't we just have an additional language?
But we don't. That's the thing. Like in history, you didn't learn everything, did you? Like I remember my history GCSEs. We just studied the history of the Russian Revolution, basically.
Really? Oh.
Yeah, and the idea was more
to focus.
to
on which exam board as well.
I think so.
That's
yeah.
another thing.
But I think the point of like history studies is to learn the tools to study history rather than learning all of history.
Yeah.
And I guess it would be the same here. You learn a language to learn the tools to study and dissect a language rather than just learning all of
But I
the
think
languages.
they could maybe be selective and make a course that combines not all ancient languages, but the big ancient language, the big three.
top five.
Like ancient Greek, Latin. There could be Egyptian. There could be call for that kind of thing.
Aramaic. Just watch The Passion of the Christ.
Yeah.
Be good.
I mean, I liked studying Latin, but I like languages in general. And I, every so often, once a year, I find it somewhat useful that I can recognize some Latin-y bit of language.
E pluribus unum.
It is, yes.
What's another good bit of Latin? Tell us some Latin.
Well, what bone? Well, this came up the other day. What
Habeas corpus.
Uh-huh.
Well, I was on the train the other day and I realised like tibula, like bula. Where does that come from? Like your tibula, like different
Fibula
types
and
of
tibula.
bones. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And
Problem is
like
bone, isn't it?
like my wife said, like, you know, this we call this shoulder blade.
Mm.
Apparently, there's like a Latin word for a medical word for that. And it had bulla in. I was like, oh, that probably means bone.
Imagine if you'd had the chance to study Latin at school now.
No, that's the kind of thing where it would come in handy. You say, oh, that comes from Latin, that. But that's just to show up your wife, whose English is her second language. So that's where it would come. Elitist, you know. Yeah. Bones. Yeah.
But at the same time, like, I mean, it's perfectly understandable why it would be dropped as a subject.
Yeah.
Basically.
But if we're going to drop it in one place, should we drop it everywhere?
I don't think so. I mean, there's a secondary school, maybe primary and secondary school, private boys' school in Croydon, in England, that my father taught at, and he taught Japanese, I think GCSE and A level, and it's just, I mean, it's a relatively large school, but it was at the time, and may still be, the largest Japanese learning center in the UK.
Right.
And it's, you know, I guess if you want to learn Japanese, you go there.
Right, if you're in the catchment area.
Well, no, I think, yeah, I guess so. You could have something similar for Latin, I suppose.
I suppose.
No, I was just going to say, like, if it's not a profit, like, because a lot of stuff in education these days, education is talked about as like commodification, right?
Neoliberal.
Yeah. And if it's not a valuable commodity, then they'll just get rid of it. But I think there are some arguments for why it could be valuable, but I don't think there are enough.
Well, do we want education to be a commodity? I mean, learning for learning's sake.
I mean,
but also, I think, part of the reason it's probably lasted so long is because it was Latin as a language, as the kind of, you know, mother language of all these other European languages, was held in such high regard.
Yeah.
So, you know, applying the rules of Latin to English for grammar and those kind of things.
Right.
So it's not surprising that it's had a sharp decline.
It's a prestige thing.
Yeah.
Well, it's an ongoing question. But anyway, that is this episode's TEFL News. Richmond School has stopped teaching Latin. What a shame.
TEFL Cultures.
So this episode's TEFL culture is about, I'm pretty sure we haven't discussed this, negotiation of meaning. Or negotiation for meaning.
What do you mean by negotiation of meaning?
Well, that's my question for you. So how would you define negotiation of / for meaning?
What do you mean between students in like a language activity sense, or?
I mean, let's start more generally, just in terms of any interaction.
When you don't fully comprehend what somebody wants to say, and you want to check what they're trying to say, basically.
Yeah, I'd say like using linguistic resources to kind of collaboratively construct a meaning between two people.
Getting all lofty and academic.
Yeah.
Okay. I've got a couple of definitions here. First is long. Michael.
Oh right, I was going to say try and cut it down.
It is kind of long, actually. So the first, so he defines it as the process in which, in an effort to communicate, learners and competent speakers provide and interpret signals of their own and their interlocutors' perceived comprehension, thus provoking adjustments to linguistic form, conversational structure, message content, or all three, until an acceptable level of understanding is achieved.
Yeah.
Okay.
Works for me.
Okay. Here's another one. This is Ellison Barkhuizen.
I think it's
Barkhuizen?
We're going to be interviewing him next week.
Future
I think it's Barkhuizen.
Okay.
But we'll find that out.
So they say it refers to the conversational exchanges that arise when interlocutors seek to prevent a communicative impasse occurring or to remedy an actual impasse that has arisen. Yep.
So it's all about a communicative impasse, these seem to be. But that's not my understanding of it.
Yeah, but not necessarily. I mean, my understanding was always like fixing or avoiding or, communication breakdowns. Cases when,
How do you define a communication breakdown? Sorry.
So, I mean, well, going back a little bit, do you know where the term comes from?
Negotiation of meaning?
Yeah.
No.
I would have thought it'd come from like somebody who worked within what's his name? The guy who wrote about politeness, and I forgot his name. Searle.
John Searle.
Yeah. Because it's kind of like a discourse.
That wasn't politeness, was it? Politeness was.
He wrote the book about politeness. But so I was going to say it's like a discourse marker, isn't it? It could be a form of discourse marking, negotiation of meaning.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know if it's often classified that way, because it's almost something like meta on top of discourse or those other forms of interaction. And it's not always necessary, obviously.
Right.
I couldn't find its actual origin, and maybe it's very obvious and it exists out there, but I couldn't find it. But maybe the first...
Is that what you were asking us? Were you doing your homework for you?
Yeah, I was hoping you had checked for me. But I think, what I always associated it with, and I don't know if this is true or not, is, are you familiar with Sandra Savignon's work?
I've heard the name, but I don't know.
She was like an early proponent of CLT in general.
Future pioneer, perhaps?
Certainly.
Balance the genders?
Certainly.
As we've been forcibly told on Twitter.
But she has a, I don't know, famous, but she has a what I think is a fairly accurate definition of communication. So this whole idea of a communicative approach or communicative language teaching, where the goal is communicative competence, obviously you have to decide what does communication mean. What is communication? And her definition is that it's the expression, interpretation, and negotiation of meaning. So expression, more or less what you do as a speaker, interpretation, what you do as a listener, and then negotiation, the interaction between the two to make sure that what is being expressed matches as closely to what is being interpreted.
So the reason I was asking before about how you were defining a communication breakdown was, it seems to me that most interaction goes on in a kind of a halfway, maybe not most, but a lot of interaction happens in kind of a halfway house, like we just don't bother, and people are slightly differently interpreting things, especially between my learners.
Right.
And so negotiation meaning for me has always been about the learners coming to some joint understanding of something, but it's not about necessarily one person's understanding being the correct one and the other person trying to get at that. It's about one person expressing something, another person, as you say, interpreting that, and then them negotiating towards something that's agreeable to both. If you see what I mean? I've not expressed that very well.
No, I understand. Yeah, no, I think I have a similar idea, which is that so then coming back to your question about what's the definition of a communication breakdown, I would say it could be I guess you could measure it as a minor or a major breakdown, which is just in terms of the gap between what's being expressed and what's being interpreted.
Right.
But that's also an interesting idea. You're talking about how maybe what's been expressed is interpreted in a different way, and they're never going to match perfectly. So the two work together to find something in the middle.
And what you express doesn't necessarily reflect what you mean, right? Because all communication is indirect. I don't have access to your thoughts. And maybe you don't have access exactly to what you mean to say. There's always that thing. That's not quite what I meant to say. And so all communication is negotiated to an extent, right?
Even just from the expression side or just the interpretation
side. When I was sort of looking into this, often negotiation of meaning isn't a term that's it's used, but they often talk about it in terms of feedback as well. And they talk about is it LREs, learner related or language related episodes. They talk about they talk about negotiation meaning as feedback or peer feedback, and that's another way of analysing negotiation meaning in terms of just an umbrella term, feedback. Any back channeling, like any kind of response is
so within language teaching or second language acquisition even, negotiation of meaning is often it's often talked about. People often focus on it in terms of interactions between native and non-native speakers or learners and teachers. And in the learner-teacher dynamic, people do often focus on it in terms of feedback. When a teacher's interacting with the student will make some kind of error, I guess, or a mistake, and the teacher will they'll negotiate the meaning until the learner produces the correct form.
So the learner does what they want.
Because like Rob was saying, I don't think there needs to be a communication breakdown to prompt negotiation of meaning. Like I think any time somebody says something, you'll repeat it back to them when you're negotiating what they've said. On a very minute level.
Or just a desire to clarify. It doesn't. a breakdown doesn't need to have happened for there to be a desire to clarify something.
Yeah.
No. So sometimes it's to avoid
It's preemptive.
avoiding a breakdown or checking that a breakdown isn't happening.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Or it's developmental. You're helping them develop their idea as well.
Right.
Perhaps,
That's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know if that would be part of negotiation of meaning,
Well,
but maybe there's probably a grey
depends
area.
what the purpose of the interaction is.
I mean, I think sometimes when it's the teacher-student dynamic, teachers are doing it like not genuinely. Like they do understand what the student is saying, but they're kind of forcing them to improve the quality of their output. Which to me doesn't feel right in a way.
Yeah.
It's a different issue. But
I had a thing recently where I had to correct a student as part of a task. Like my role was to correct, kind of overcorrect, and I corrected the student on something that I thought that they had said, and then I realised that wasn't what they were trying to say, but they carried on saying the wrong thing at that point. So I made their English worse. I'm a good teacher.
The negotiation of meaning, for a while, it was closely linked with SLA theory in terms of, especially in terms of the input hypothesis and Krashen's ideas of input and that kind of thing.
The interaction hypothesis.
And the interaction hypothesis later. But it was looked at there because the idea of the input hypothesis was this idea that students need good input, strong input, and that's going to improve their overall language acquisition. So a lot of the research into negotiation of meaning was looking at it just as a way to make the input better. So if students or if two people are interacting, and they're getting bad input, the negotiation of meaning is going to improve the quality of their input. So it wasn't even about necessarily communicating messages clearly. It was as a way to improve language acquisition, grammatical forms and those kinds of things. But I think it's moved on from there, and I think maybe the focus now is more on, good communication in terms of messages being conveyed.
Right.
Do you think it's important to teach negotiation of meaning to students?
Yeah, so like Rob was saying earlier, I think it seems contrived to say, oh, you should respond by saying, do you understand, or you should respond. That seems a little bit contrived, but I think, is
there any place for contrivance in language learning?
No, definitely. I think, if everybody buys into it and knows that's what you're doing, and it's explicit, then I think it's okay. But I think they'll naturally do that anyway. Like, if you listen to the way that they talk to each other anyway, they're probably negotiating. Anyway. It's hard to quantify that.
I was going to say that I think the kind of the overt, I've pre-selected this thing that I'm going to teach you about a thing that you can do. I'm not so keen on that, but I do like the idea of almost like a dogma style of teaching negotiation, meaning where when students do try to do it, you can give them a phrase or you can help them with some language which is useful for doing whatever it is they're trying to do. But I feel I sometimes feel it's a little bit patronising to say to a student. So if someone says something you don't understand, you can ask them, "What do you mean?"
Right.
Well, it's all about. This is all kind of focus on form, isn't it? And it all kind of ties into that area of form-focused instruction or preemptive form-focused instruction.
I mean, you could also teach it as kind of functional language, in this situation to express this idea that you don't understand something. Here's a phrase you use.
Right.
But I mean, I think what you say is interesting. That there's research on both sides saying that there's a lot of articles, and Dornier used to write a lot about this, and more recently, Nakatani has written about it, looking at studies and research into the teachability of negotiation of meaning.
Right.
And as you'd imagine, some studies say yes, some studies say no.
Yeah. But have they looked at different types of teaching, those studies?
The ones that I'm familiar with, no. Like they had a control group where they didn't introduce the phrases at all explicitly, and others where they did.
Because I guess you could do it as a kind of a corrective feedback and uptake type thing, which is what I'm talking about. And that'd be interesting to see if that's more effective than just pre-selecting phrases and saying, use this in this situation.
Do you think it depends on the level of the learner, whether or not or how to teach negotiation of meaning?
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to know where, because obviously they're learning in a second language, but it's hard to know where the human inclination to want to negotiate something, where that's influence of first or second language. If that makes sense. So I think anyone's going to negotiate or have the need to, but it's hard to know where that line comes if it's a foreign language or a. Yeah.
So negotiation of meaning is, it's considered part of, it can be classified as a communication strategy. But there are like achievement strategies where you're trying to negotiate, but then there are also reduction strategies which includes things like abandoning your message or switching to L1, those kind of things.
Right.
So, some, and it may be learner level, or it might be motivation, or it might be affective, factors. But, some students may be just more likely to abandon their message rather than go through the process of negotiating.
Yeah. But also, students use clues other than the linguistic to interpret things. Yeah. So I think sometimes if you say to students, so this person said this, do you know exactly what they meant? Like, no, but I had a pretty basic, I could guess based on, the context and the other stuff we were talking about and that kind of thing. So it wasn't necessary for me to go, and it would have been, as you said before, contrived to say, so what you're saying is, Yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes messages aren't clear, so maybe some students are more inclined to negotiate than others. That's what you're saying, right?
Yeah, certainly. Yeah. Do you think it's a skill that you develop in your L1? In English, are you a good negotiator of meaning?
Yeah.
What do you mean by good?
Well, I've been thinking about this a lot recently, about like how to be a better listener, just in general, just in not talking about myself too much and asking more questions to people. Yeah, just being a bit more aware of actually listening to what people are saying.
Yep.
Maybe that is, but because some people don't listen.
So you would include negotiation meaning as a good listening skill? Or as
definitely,
part of being a good listener?
yeah. Just picking up on words or saying, what do you mean by that? Or go back to that point. That kind of thing. I think it's a life skill.
Do you think sometimes when people focus too much on that, they're a bit annoying?
What do you mean by that? Yeah, they could be. Yeah.
Have you ever had a conversation with someone who's a little bit too into what you're saying, and they're like going, no, let me ask you another question about that. And what do you mean by it's?
I feel like sometimes you can tell when somebody's just read a book about how to be a good listener.
Exactly,
and they overdo it.
Yeah, some people prefer to be the listener rather than the speaker in group dynamics, right?
I don't like that. I don't like it when I ask someone a question and they respond with a question, and it's like...
They're not,
they don't give you anything. They just expect you to do all the talking.
Exactly. And it's like, I'm being a good listener, but actually it's kind of being selfish, I think. It's like, they're not contributing anything, and I don't like talking about myself all the time, most of the time, obviously, like everyone else, but...
Okay, that was this episode's TEFL culture. Negotiation... We haven't decided, negotiation of meaning or for meaning?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
I guess they refer to different things, do they not?
Negotiation with meaning, I guess. Right?
Negotiation about meaning.
That's a good point, though. It's not.
Are you negotiating the meaning of it, or are you negotiating to arrive at?
I'd say
both.
Yeah.
It's both, but I'd say more the second than the first.
Okay.
Yeah. Because I don't think the meaning is an existent thing out there. I think the meaning is constructed between people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay, we'll end there. Negotiation for meaning.
Thank you for listening to today's episode.
Don't forget, if you'd like to get in contact with us, you can email us at TEFLology@gmail.com. Follow us on Twitter @TEFLology. Listen to old episodes in a number of different places now. You can listen directly through our website, TEFLology-podcast.com, through SoundCloud, although we're having a few issues with that, so give that a rest for a bit. And we now have all of our episodes on YouTube, so you can watch all of our episodes on YouTube or listen on YouTube.
There's nothing to watch, right?
No, it's just our logo. And don't forget to rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you listen to your digest your podcast. Is that what they say in the podcasting world?
I guess so. They do now.
Yeah.
And we also have our book,
Oh, yeah.
Podcasting and Professional Development, a guide for English language teachers, published by The Round and available at a very reasonable price on Amazon and Smashwords.
Okay, so it's goodbye from me.
Goodbye from me.
Goodbye.